We need someone younger and cheaper. That's what they told Marcus Dorsey, a 50-year-old executive who had spent 15 years building an empire of trust, one client at a time. Fired without warning by a flashy new director with big data dreams, Marcus walked out silently, but not empty-handed. Because what they didn't realize was, he was the reason the clients stayed. What followed was a stunning reversal of power. Clients defected, legal threats flew. And when the dust settled, the man they discarded returned. Not to destroy them, but to save what they couldn't rebuild. This is the story of what happens when you underestimate the quiet man and mistake loyalty for something you can replace. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. We need someone younger, someone cheaper. The words landed like a slap across the glass desk, sharp and unapologetic. Brandon Keene didn't even flinch when he said them. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his manicured hands behind his head like he'd just solved a business equation, not gutted a man's career. I didn't respond right away. I watched him, watched how comfortably he lounged in a suit that probably cost more than my first car. His office smelled faintly of new carpet, lavender diffusers, and self-importance. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline gleamed in morning light. But I didn't see any of it. I was focused on the man across from me, the man who just cut me loose like a loose thread. My name is Marcus Dorsey. I'd introduced myself that same way for 15 years. Senior Client Relations Executive. Axis Point Group. I wasn't just an employee, I was one of its foundations. I had been there since it was nothing but a borrowed floor in a dilapidated building on South Wacker, back when the company was still called Central Equity Solutions. Back before any investor had heard of it. But now, none of that mattered. You understand, right? Brandon added, lifting a single brow. It's not personal. It's just where the market is going. Your skill set, its legacy. We need fresh perspectives, digital first, Gen Z fluency. I almost laughed. Instead, I glanced down at the slim manila folder he'd pushed across the desk like a final insult. Inside, I already knew, was my termination package. 8 minutes of conversation to erase 15 years of loyalty. I understand, I said calmly. Brandon looked almost relieved. That's the thing about people like him. They expect you to break down or rage. My composure unnerved him more than anger ever could. I rose from the chair, picked up the folder, and paused. You're not firing a number, Brandon. You're firing the person this entire client base trusts. He waved that off with a tight smile. Trust is scalable. Systems are scalable. We've got CRM software now that can track everything. Relationships are important, sure, but replaceable. Replaceable. It echoed through me as I walked back to my office. 15 years of shaking hands, answering calls at midnight, flying across the country for client emergencies. And now I was replaceable. I stepped into my office, closed the door, and let the silence settle. My name still gleamed on the brass plaque. Marcus Dorsey, Senior Executive, Client Services. Not for much longer. I sat at my desk, letting my eyes roam across the framed photos. Jessica's college graduation, a fishing trip with a longtime client, a dinner with the team after closing the Westridge deal. I wasn't just part of Axis Point, I was Axis Point, for the people who mattered. A knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Lisa from accounting lingering awkwardly in the doorway. She'd been with the company nearly as long as I had. You okay? She asked gently. I nodded. I'm fine. They don't know what they're doing, she whispered, stepping in. Brandon's convinced the board he's some kind of visionary, streamlining, cost optimization, whatever the buzzword is this week. I gave her a tired smile. Don't worry about me, Lisa. I've seen this kind of vision before. It usually runs out of steam just before the next quarterly report. She hesitated. If you need a reference or anything, I won't, I said. Not because I was arrogant, but because I'd already started thinking 3 steps ahead. I didn't need Axis Point. Axis Point needed me. The strange thing about being fired is how quickly clarity follows. By the time I was driving home, a cardboard box filled with 15 years of my life riding shotgun, I wasn't mourning. I was planning. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove in silence, letting every highway mile burn away the numbness. But once I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, I picked up my phone. My daughter Jessica answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad. Wait, you're calling me in the middle of a Tuesday?" They let me go. There was a pause. "Wait, what? Why?" I could hear the disbelief in her voice, like someone had just told her the sky was purple. "New leadership." I said, "New direction, new budget, you know how it is." "They fired you, after everything you've done for them?" I smiled, oddly comforted by her outrage. "It's okay, Jess. It's just business." "No, it's not okay," she snapped. "You practically built that company." "Built relationships," I corrected gently. "Not the company, there's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "So, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to remind a few people who they used to call when things got hard." That night, I opened an old leather binder, my personal client logs, not the corporate CRM. These were my notes, scribbles, memories, fragments of real connection. James from Kenford Logistics, daughter's wedding in 2018. Loves scotch, hates sushi. Catherine, from Redwood Investments, lost her husband in 2020. I hand-delivered her renewal in person. These weren't names, they were people, and they didn't call Access Point when things went wrong. They called me. The next morning, I reached out to an old friend, Devin Blake, now senior partner at Sterling & Rowe. He and I had worked together back in the early days, long before venture capital came knocking. "Marcus," he said warmly over the phone. "What a surprise." "They let me go," I said. "Idiots," he replied instantly. "What happened?" I gave him the abbreviated version. "Brandon. Restructuring. Younger, cheaper talent." "I've got space," Devin said without hesitation. "We're expanding our client services division, and I know you'd bring more than just experience." "I need flexibility," I said, "and I don't want a title. I want control. I want to do it the old way, the right way." "You want to rebuild relationships from the ground up?" "No," I said. "I want to remind people they never left." The plan was already in motion. While Brandon was scheduling algorithm tests and redesigning slide decks, I was remembering birthdays, anniversaries, and what wine James at Kenford liked to serve at client dinners. When I finally turned off the lights that night, I didn't feel defeated. I felt reborn. Because here's the truth. Corporations forget, but people remember. And the next chapter of my story would not be about revenge. It would be about reclaiming what was always mine. "You're not part of the new vision, Marcus." That phrase kept replaying in my head, like static. I hadn't slept much, but not out of anxiety, out of calculation. While Brandon Keene was probably still patting himself on the back for a cost-efficient restructure, I was laying out a personal roadmap. Not of vengeance, but of reclamation. I poured my first cup of coffee before sunrise and opened the binder again. Not the kind you get from HR, but the one you only build through time. 15 years of conversations, notes, and emotional intelligence written in shorthand and ink. This wasn't data. This was loyalty on paper. Page 1, James Redford. Kenford Logistics. Our relationship began during a warehouse fire. His team was in chaos, their supply chain in ruins. It wasn't an algorithm that got them back up and running. It was me. I worked with him through the night to source alternative distributors, called in favors from Chicago to Kansas City. He'd called me a brother by sunrise. Page 3, Catherine Lee, Redwood Investments. Widowed unexpectedly, left to run a $600 million portfolio alone. When she canceled a contract renewal during that nightmare, I didn't try to win her back. I just drove 6 hours, sat with her in silence, and promised she'd never have to deal with the business side alone again. She renewed 2 days later. Not because of price, because of trust. None of these clients had ever said, "I love Access Point." They said, "Marcus, I need your advice." They said, "Marcus, I trust you with this." Not the brand, not the logo, me. And now that I wasn't bound by Access Point's firewall of red tape and approval loops, I had something even more powerful. Freedom. By noon, I made my first strategic move. Not a mass email, not a LinkedIn announcement. That would look desperate. No, I reached out to the people who mattered most in every company, the executive assistants, the gatekeepers, the ones who booked flights, managed calendars, screened calls. I composed each message carefully. "Hi Carla, I just wanted to let you know I've moved to a new firm, Sterling & Rowe. No pitch, no pressure. Just wanted to share in case Mr. Redford ever needs to reach me directly. All the best, Marcus." No logos, no attachments, no sales language, just respect. By 4 p.m., I had replies from 4 of the 10 assistants I'd contacted. All said some version of the same thing. They'll want to know. Stand by. By 7 p.m., I had 3 texts from clients, direct lines. 2 of them hadn't used those numbers in over a year. By 9 p.m., James Redford called. No assistant, no voicemail, straight to me. Marcus, thank God. His voice was tight but not angry. Concerned. I met your replacement yesterday. Brandon, right? I sighed. That's what they told me. He spent 45 minutes talking about synergy, James grumbled. Didn't ask a single question about our expansion in Toledo. Didn't even remember my daughter's name, and you know she just started at Northwestern. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The silence said it all. So where are you now? Sterling and Rowe. Do they know what they're getting? They will. Soon. Send the paperwork. We follow you. It was said with such calm certainty, like James wasn't switching financial allegiances, but simply continuing a friendship. That was the key difference Brandon would never understand. Contracts are ink. Trust is blood. By the next morning, I'd had 5 more messages. Clients asking where I'd gone, if I was okay, how they could get in touch. I didn't pitch anyone. I simply answered truthfully, yes, I've moved. No pressure. Happy to reconnect when the time is right. But I wasn't the only one who noticed. That afternoon, Sterling and Rowe's legal team received a cease and desist from Access Point. The email subject line was bold and breathless. Urgent, alleged client poaching in breach of non-solicitation clause. Devin Blake handed me the printout with a smirk. They're scared. They should be, I said, but they're also wrong. I hadn't breached a single clause. I hadn't made a pitch. I hadn't pulled a document. I hadn't even used my Access Point contact list. These people found me. Loyalty doesn't get deleted when you shut off an employee badge. Sterling's lawyers confirmed I was clean. You're not soliciting. Clients are acting independently. As long as it stays that way, you're protected. I nodded. Perfect. 2 days later, I got a call from Lisa. Brandon's in full panic mode, she whispered. Really? Client retention teams are working 18-hour days. The board's demanding explanations. Brandon told them you hacked the CRM. I laughed out loud. Lisa, I've never even used the CRM, remember? I know. That's why it's funny. It's already doing an audit. They won't find anything. And when they don't, they'll realize what they've lost. She paused. Be careful, Marcus. He's desperate now. He bet everything on you being dispensable. I nodded to myself. Let them keep betting. That weekend, I cleared the last step. Catherine Lee called me from her private line. I heard about the move. Smart choice. How are you holding up? I asked. Well, Brandon's been aggressive. He called me twice this week. First time in 2 years he's paid attention to my firm. I chuckled. Better late than never. I didn't like his tone, she said. He spoke in percentages and timelines, not people. That's his style. I miss yours. A pause. Would it be too soon to ask for your new terms? I smiled. Not at all. By Monday morning, Sterling and Rowe had officially onboarded 6 major clients formerly with Access Point, all without a single cold call. No promotions, no deals, just relationships migrating to where they felt safe again. Brandon still didn't understand. But he would. You handled that better than most would have. Devin Blake stood in my doorway holding a pair of coffees and that familiar sly grin of his. I've had people show up with lawsuits, burner phones, and attitude problems. You came with a binder and a game plan. I took the coffee. That's because I started planning long before Brandon made his move. He raised an eyebrow, curious. How long? 6 months, I said, sitting down behind my new desk, smaller than the one at Access Point, but far more empowering. I saw the writing on the wall the day he walked into our quarterly review and didn't ask a single question about client retention. He just flipped through charts about margins and trends. Devin chuckled. MBA kids love trends. No one ever won trust by optimizing it. I opened my binder again, now updated with new notes, assistant responses, and client handovers already in progress. It wasn't just a portfolio. It was a map of everything Brandon had overlooked. While he'd been analyzing compensation benchmarks, I'd been memorizing people. He shook his head. You've done more in 5 days than most onboarding teams do in 5 months. I'm not onboarding, I replied. I'm restoring. The truth was, my mental countdown had started when Gerald Stone, the founder of Access Point, announced his retirement. Gerald was old school. Rolodex, handshake, face-to-face. He once told me over scotch, people sign with people, Marcus, not with acronyms. When he stepped down, I knew the soul of the company had walked out with him. Then Brandon arrived. Slick, 34, jargon-loaded, with a jawline made for press releases. In his first team meeting, he introduced himself as an agent of creative disruption. He flashed his Harvard MBA like a backstage pass and promised to modernize everything, including me. That's when I'd made my first quiet move. I reached out to Devin. Devin and I went back years, back to the cramped, coffee-stained days of early client hunts and red-eye flights. He'd moved to Sterling and Rowe after our startup days, and over the years, we'd stayed in touch over bourbon and war stories. Thinking of jumping ship? He'd asked me over lunch last fall. Just checking if your lifeboats are seaworthy, I'd answered. We'd laughed, but both of us knew it was a real question masked in metaphor. Devin had nodded and said, "If it ever comes to it, I've got space." Now, sitting across from him as a Sterling and Rowe partner in progress, I realized the lifeboat had been more than seaworthy. It had a GPS, champagne, and room to grow. That evening, I pulled up to Crestwood Golf Club, parked discreetly in the back lot, and waited. I wasn't there for a round. At 2:03 p.m., Brandon pulled up in a silver Audi, stepped out, and adjusted his cufflinks. He was there to meet James Redford, my client, for the last 10 years. They greeted each other on the front steps. I watched closely. Brandon's overly firm handshake, the obligatory back pat, the desperate enthusiasm of someone who knew they were performing. James's smile was polite, distant. Not cold, just not warm. I didn't need to be in the meeting to know what was going wrong. Brandon would talk too much. He'd offer numbers, statistics, flashy incentives, but he wouldn't ask about James's daughter. He wouldn't know about the warehouse expansion, the Christmas delays, the suppliers in Ohio who were slow to respond, because that wasn't in any CRM. That lived in me. As they made their way to the first tee, a quiet calm settled inside me. Not anger, not even satisfaction. Clarity. Brandon was trying to step into shoes he couldn't fill because he didn't even understand the ground they were built for. I started the engine, and I drove to Sterling and Rowe's downtown office with a new resolve. "Let's talk terms," I told Devin as I walked into his office. He blinked. "I thought you were taking a week." "I've already wasted too many years on people who didn't value what matters." Devin leaned forward. "Go on." I laid out everything. I want full autonomy over client onboarding. No red tape, no marketing scripts, my own team structure, and most importantly, no enforcement of non-competes that would block clients from following me on their own. I won't poach, but I won't hold them back either. Devin didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called in Patricia Rowe herself, co-founder and legal savant. She listened carefully as I repeated my terms. "You're asking to bring your client base," she said flatly. I didn't flinch. "I'm not taking anything that belongs to Access Point. The contracts, the folders, sure, they own those. But the trust, the loyalty, that's mine." She leaned back, folding her arms. "You're confident they'll follow?" "I've already had 6 calls," I said, "and I've made 0 pitches." Patricia stared at me for a long, evaluating pause. "Make it happen," she said at last, "and the terms are yours." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and an open laptop. The light above buzzed faintly. The house felt too quiet. Jessica wouldn't visit until the weekend, but my mind was loud with purpose. I began writing names, not just the top executives, their assistants, their analysts, their gatekeepers. Every person I'd remembered at birthday parties who'd sent thank you notes, who'd laughed with me in lobbies or cried on bad days. I wrote not because I needed them, but because I remembered them. At 10 p.m., I started sending short, respectful emails. No attachments, no pitches. Just, "Hi again. Just wanted to share where I've landed in case you ever need to reach me directly. Hope you're well, Marcus." By midnight, I had 7 replies. Not all were formal. One said, "Thank God. James has been wondering where you went." Carla. Another simply wrote, "They're going to regret this. Let's talk Monday." Lindsay. I closed the laptop and sat back. I hadn't built a company. I'd built a circle of trust. And now, one quiet message at a time, it was coming back to me. He didn't even ask about my daughter's graduation. That was the first thing James Redford said when I picked up the phone. No hello. No small talk. Just a weary, pointed frustration spoken like a man who felt unseen. I'm not surprised, I said, already knowing how the golf meeting went. James chuckled dryly. He used the word synergy 5 times before we reached the 3rd hole. Tried to tell me that Access Point's client-forward AI would redefine our engagement model. Whatever that means. I could picture it too clearly. Brandon, decked out in his tailored blazer, tossing around buzzwords like confetti, assuming charm could substitute for history. What he didn't realize was that James and I didn't build a client engagement model. We built trust over canceled flights, supplier screw-ups, and quiet check-ins on holidays. He asked me if I was comfortable with pivoting to a scalable value proposition, James continued, exasperated. I said I was more comfortable with someone who remembered I don't eat red meat. I smiled. That's how I got you to sign the first contract, remember? With a grilled salmon lunch. Exactly, he said. Then he went quiet for a beat. I miss how you do things, Marcus. You never sold to me. You partnered with me. That's always been the difference. Another pause. Send me the transfer forms, he said finally. Let's make it official. By the time I hung up, my desk already had a neat stack of files from Sterling and Rowe's onboarding team. 4 more clients were in transition. Catherine Lee had sent back signed documents with a handwritten note. Finally, a place where people matter again. It wasn't just business. It was a quiet rebellion against the machine Access Point had become. At Access Point, meanwhile, the boardroom was on fire. Lisa called me the next morning. They've lost it, she whispered over the phone. Brandon's blaming the CRM, saying the data leak is internal. Data leak? I laughed. I haven't opened a corporate document since the day I left. I know, but he's desperate. He told the board you must have taken client information with you. And IT? Running full audits. Brandon doesn't know half the systems himself. He thought you downloaded client profiles. I didn't even have login access, I said. Lisa laughed under her breath. That's the best part. Everyone knows that. Then what are they hoping to find? Something to blame, she said softly. He told the board he could slash costs without losing a single client. Now you've taken 6. 7, I corrected. James just signed. A stunned silence. Marcus, she breathed, that's nearly a third of our annual portfolio. I know. Later that day, I got the email. Subject, cease and desist. Immediate action required. The message was long, inflated with legal jargon and half-baked threats. It claimed I was interfering with proprietary relationships, that I was violating my non-solicitation clause, that I must immediately cease all client engagement tied to my previous role. It ended with a passive-aggressive olive branch. We are willing to discuss a settlement prior to formal litigation. Brandon Keene, Director of Strategic Operations, Access Point Group. I printed it and slid it across Devon's desk. He's sweating, Devon said with a smile. The board must be leaning on him. He still doesn't understand, I said. He thinks I took something. Devon leaned back. You didn't. No, I said. I earned it. That evening, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A text message. Brandon Keene. We should talk. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. at Copper and Oak downtown. This doesn't need to get uglier. It wasn't a request. It was a plea. The next morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. Copper and Oak was a quiet brunch spot near the lakefront. Dim wood, leather booths, and enough privacy for deals and denials alike. I chose a booth at the far end, back to the wall, with full visibility of the door. At 9:05, Brandon walked in, pressed, polished, and brittle. His usual confident swagger was undercut by the tightness in his shoulders and the faint clench in his jaw. His smile when he spotted me was practiced, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. Thanks for coming, he said as he slid into the booth. I said nothing. I think, he began, we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I stared at him, letting the silence speak. He leaned forward. Look, what would it take to slow this down? I'm sure we can make this work for everyone. Whatever Sterling and Rowe's offering, we can match. Add a signing bonus even. I tilted my head. You think this is about money? He hesitated. Everything's about money. That, I said, is why you're losing. Brandon's expression faltered. I placed my coffee cup down slowly. The clients who followed me, they didn't leave for better rates. They left because I remembered their kids' names, because I showed up on weekends, because I never treated them like line items. He scoffed. Spare me the sentimental pitch. Let's talk practically. Name your price to stop this exodus. I haven't poached anyone, I replied calmly. I didn't ask anyone to leave. They came to me. Brandon stared at me, visibly trying to steady his breathing. The board brought me in to modernize Access Point, he said. To cut costs, streamline. How's that working out? I asked. How many clients have left? 7, he snapped. 7 clients who represent nearly 32% of your annual billing. He blinked. You didn't even know that, did you? I said softly. Because you weren't looking at client value reports, just salaries. He said nothing. His face lost color. I leaned forward. If you go back to the board and lie, tell them I breached contract, stole data, you'll be caught. The audit will clear me, the clients will tell the truth, and you'll lose everything. His voice was a whisper now. What do you want? To be left alone, I said, and to build something better. He stared at me for a long time, then his phone buzzed. One glance, and he stood abruptly. I need to take this. Of course you do. He turned and left the restaurant, phone to his ear, a storm brewing in his face. I sipped my coffee. We were finished. That afternoon, Devin walked into my office with raised brows. You just got a call. Who from? Gerald Stone. I looked up. The founder? Devin nodded. He said the Access Point board wants to talk to you. Emergency meeting. They want it yesterday. I didn't respond, just leaned back in my chair, eyes on the skyline. The pieces were moving. And Brandon had no idea how far behind he already was. They want you back. That was the first thing Gerald Stone said when I picked up the call later that night. No greetings, no pleasantries, just that heavy statement spoken in his familiar, gravel tone. I stood in my kitchen, lights dimmed, phone to my ear, staring at the steam rising from a cup of untouched chamomile tea. I figured the board would reach out, I replied. They must have noticed the bleeding. They've noticed the artery's been sliced, he said. You took 7 of the top 15 accounts in 10 days. Catherine, James, Redgrove Analytics, Glenhurst Finance, he sighed. That's nearly a third of total billing, and the ones that remain are skittish. I said nothing, just listened. You could ask for Brandon's job, you know, Gerald continued. They'd give it to you. Hell, they'd gift wrap it with a bonus and a corner office. I smiled faintly. That's not what I want. A beat of silence. Then what do you want, Marcus? I looked at the photo framed on my wall, a picture of the original Access Point crew back when we were Central Equity Solutions. Just 4 of us, standing outside a rented office with folding chairs and whiteboards held together with tape. Gerald had his arms slung around my shoulders in that photo. His smile had been genuine then. So had the mission. I want to build something sustainable, I said. Something that protects the people caught in the middle. The clients? Gerald asked. And the employees. The next morning, I laid everything out for Patricia Rowe. We propose a partnership, I said, clicking through the slides I'd prepared. Sterling and Rowe, an Access Point group, shared services. Clients choose their primary provider, but retain access to both firms' resources. Patricia leaned back, arms crossed, as Devin watched from the other side of the table. And Brandon? That's not my concern. I thought you'd want his job. I shook my head. I don't want his title. I want his damage contained. She studied me. This would stabilize both companies, preserve jobs, reduce risk, but it also means offering a lifeline to a competitor. No, I corrected. It means offering a lifeline to the clients. The ones who were never supposed to be caught in the middle of an ego war. Patricia tapped her pen against her notebook, then smiled. You're not just trying to win, you're trying to heal. Revenge is a waste of time, I said, but restoration, that's worth everything. At 9:45 the following morning, my phone rang. Marcus, Gerald said, his voice light for the first time in weeks. They're in. All of it? Full partnership agreement. Pending legal fine-tuning, Brandon's been asked to resign, effective immediately. I closed my eyes, let the words settle. And the employees? I asked. No more restructuring. Board admits they were dazzled by cost-saving spreadsheets. Forgot what actually builds a business. I nodded slowly. Thank you, Gerald. You were always the only one who remembered the people behind the contracts. By the time I arrived at Sterling and Rowe that afternoon, news of the partnership had spread. The client relations floor was buzzing with quiet excitement. Emails pinged, phones rang, assistants from both firms were already fielding inquiries. I walked into my office and paused. On my desk sat a simple brown package. Inside, a photo. The original team, the old days. Scrawled in Gerald's handwriting on the back, "People sign contracts with people. Never forget that." I sat down and placed it beside my keyboard, right where every client could see it when they visited. A compass, a memory, a promise. That evening I had a call with Jessica. "They asked you to take over, and you said no?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "I didn't want to become the thing I spent 15 years pushing against." She laughed. "But now you basically run 2 companies." I smiled. "It's not about power, Jess. It's about stewardship." "You sound like Yoda." "Good. Yoda never fired anyone for having gray hair." The following week, the joint press announcement was made. Axis Point Group and Sterling & Rowe establish historic partnership. Clients will retain dual access to premier services. Behind the headlines, I met with every client who'd followed me. Not to gloat, not to renegotiate, but to thank them. Each conversation was a soft reaffirmation of what we'd built: trust, consistency, a sense of being seen and heard. I wasn't rebuilding, I was rerouting. Then came the ripple effect. Clients who had not yet followed reached out. Some had stayed with Axis Point out of inertia, others out of caution. But now the tone had shifted. "If you're still involved, we'll stay. You're the reason we signed in the first place. You never made us feel like a transaction." We weren't bleeding anymore. We were expanding. And Brandon, last I heard, he took a role with a tech startup in Tucson. They celebrated disruptive leadership and high-velocity onboarding. Exactly his style. Maybe he'd do better there. Maybe they'd never see the value of a well-timed phone call or handwritten note. And maybe that's what separates a visionary from a volume chaser. On the 1-month anniversary of the partnership, I stood at the podium in our main conference room. Clients from both firms were present. So were team members who'd once feared layoffs and closure. "This isn't a merger," I told the room. "It's a restoration." I paused. "It's proof that even in this era of automation, people still matter more than platforms. Relationships are not outdated, they are timeless. And today we reaffirm that business is built by trust, not trend lines." The applause wasn't thunderous. It was respectful, genuine, earned. "He told the board you hacked the CRM." Lisa's voice on the phone was half stunned, half furious. Her words hung in the air like a thundercloud waiting to burst. I was on my morning walk, a routine I'd neglected for years. Sterling & Rowe was humming with new client activity, and for the first time in a long time, I had space to breathe. But now I stopped mid-step, the tip of my shoe tapping the edge of the Riverwalk as I processed what she just said. "I haven't even logged into the CRM," I said calmly. "I know," Lisa replied. "We all know. But Brandon is desperate. He's telling the board you took proprietary client information, says that's the only way these accounts could have moved so fast." "That's insulting," I said, my voice tightening. "To me and to every client who made their own decision." "He's scrambling. He promised the board he could cut costs without losing major accounts. But the numbers," she sighed, "they're undeniable. 7 down, 3 more wavering. You're looking at almost half of Axis Point's portfolio." I looked out over the water. The breeze cut across the lake, crisp and clean. In a strange way, Brandon's accusation wasn't infuriating. It was validating. He couldn't fathom the idea that trust, not stolen data, had built this foundation. And that's why he was losing. "Let him dig," I said finally. "The deeper he goes, the more he exposes how little he understands this business." That afternoon, Devin met me in my office with a folder in hand. "Formal cease and desist letter," he said, dropping it on my desk. Same boilerplate nonsense as the email. Legal threats, alleged IP theft, interference. They're threatening to escalate. I flipped the pages slowly, scanning the inflated language like someone reading a bad script. They want me to cease contact with clients, return all information, and basically disappear. More or less. I shook my head. I haven't breached a single clause. I didn't copy files. I didn't export data. I didn't even forward an email. Devin gave me a sharp look. "I know. We've already prepped our response. We'll confirm compliance with all relevant statutes and cite client autonomy in decision-making." "Good," I said, "but let's not just defend. Let's educate." He raised an eyebrow. "I want them to know that this isn't about taking clients," I said. "This is about clients choosing, because I treated them like humans, not line items." Devin nodded. "We'll make that point crystal clear." The next morning, I walked into the Sterling & Rowe lobby to find a white envelope sitting at reception. No name, no label, just handwritten initials, MD. Inside, a short, anonymous message printed in all caps. Check access points internal chat logs. They know they're losing. Below it was a timestamp and a screenshot of an internal Slack message. Brandon, writing to HR. If we don't stop Dorsey's momentum, I'm finished. The board is already talking about succession planning. Succession planning. I folded the note and placed it in my drawer. Brandon wasn't just spiraling, he was falling apart in real time. Later that day, my phone rang again. This time, it was Catherine Lee. "You've started something," she said as soon as I answered. "I didn't mean to," I replied honestly. "But you did," she said. "James, Redgrove, Glenhurst, all of us who followed you, we're talking. There's a sense that something bigger is happening." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. For years, we tolerated mediocrity wrapped in metrics. People like Brandon convinced themselves that relationships could be digitized and trust could be outsourced to apps. I smiled faintly. "But trust doesn't scale." "Exactly," she said. "And now the ones who actually built something are finally being recognized." I didn't know what to say to that, so I thanked her, and when the call ended I realized Catherine was right. This wasn't just about Brandon or Access Point anymore. It was a reawakening. That night, I received a text from a number I hadn't saved. "Brandon Keene. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Copper Blues. In person. Let's end this." The wording was different from his previous message. Less posturing, more pleading. At 8:45 the next morning, I walked into Copper Blues. The place was half empty, dim lighting, quiet jazz in the background. I picked a table at the far wall again, where I could see every entrance and every exit. Brandon walked in at exactly 9:03. His appearance was still sharp, but his face told a different story. Dark circles under his eyes, a tautness in his jaw, and the stiff movements of someone under siege. He sat across from me, shoulders tense. "I won't waste your time," he said. "The board's coming after me. I need this to stop." I didn't respond. "They think I lied to them," he continued. "They think I underestimated the impact of letting you go." "Didn't you?" He hesitated. "I didn't think you'd be this much of a threat." "I'm not a threat, Brandon," I said calmly. "I'm just the consequence." That silenced him. "I didn't ask anyone to leave," I continued. "They left because you treated them like spreadsheets. I treated them like people." He leaned forward, almost pleading now. "What would it take to settle this?" "Settle what?" I asked. "You fired me. You insulted me. Then you tried to bury me with threats. The only thing I did was move forward." Brandon looked down at his coffee, his mask slipping further. "I just wanted to modernize the company," he muttered. "Make it leaner." "You made it hollow," I said. "There's a difference." Then I stood. "I'm not coming back. I don't want your job. But I do want you to understand something, Brandon." He looked up slowly. "You thought the work I did could be measured in dollars. But it wasn't. It was measured in loyalty. And you can't fire loyalty. You can only lose it." That afternoon, Lisa called again. "They're letting him go," she said. "Effective immediately. They asked Gerald to handle it personally." I nodded. "They're trying to course correct." "They are," she said. "And they're already in talks with your legal team about the partnership." "We'll do it right," I promised. "No gloating. Just restoration." "You're something else, Marcus," she said softly. "Not many people could have done this without tearing everything down." I looked out the window. "I didn't want to destroy," I said. "I wanted to rebuild." That night I took a long walk through the city. Chicago pulsed with light and rhythm. The wind whipped off the lake, cold but invigorating. I paused at the same bench I used to sit on during my lunch breaks 15 years ago, back when everything was new and uncertain. And I thought about what had just happened. I hadn't won a war. I'd weathered a storm. And in the process, I'd proven something bigger. Integrity scales better than ego. You still don't get it, do you? I spoke those words across the gleaming mahogany table at Copper Blues, the morning sun slanting through the tall windows, casting long shadows between us. Brandon Keene sat across from me, the once cocky veneer of a rising star now cracked under the weight of a failing strategy. His hands, once animated and confident, were clenched into anxious knots on the table. "This isn't about money," I said again, slowly, like I was talking to someone who hadn't been listening for years. "That's why you're losing." He blinked, as if he was trying to refocus, trying to grasp a concept just beyond his understanding. "The same way people do when they stare at a spreadsheet and expect it to show them the soul of a company. Everything about him looked polished. His tailored blazer, crisp collar, Rolex that caught the light just right. But his eyes were bloodshot. His shoulders drooped, and for once, he looked like the youngest person in the room. "I didn't come here to argue," he said, voice quiet but strained. "The board is furious. They're demanding numbers, explanations. They want answers I don't have. That's because they were trusting you to understand something you've never earned," I said. He frowned. "Like what?" "Trust." He flinched. It was subtle, barely a twitch, but I saw it. "You walked in here," I continued, "thinking this job was about restructuring and performance indicators. And maybe some of it is. But the real part, the human part, takes years. It takes weekends. It takes remembering a client's daughter's name and calling them on the day of her recital, not because it's a tactic, but because you care." Brandon's face tensed. "I didn't fire you to insult you. No, you fired me because you didn't see the value. You saw a salary. You saw gray hair. You thought younger meant better." He didn't deny it. "I gave you no resistance when I left," I added, "because I already knew what you didn't. Those clients didn't call Access Point. They called me." He shifted uncomfortably. "We can still fix this. You've proven your point. You're clearly a force in the market. If it's money, we can talk compensation, bonuses, advisory agreements." "You still think this is a transaction," I said, almost amused. "You think the clients followed me because I offered them a better deal, didn't you?" "No," I said firmly. "I offered them something you never could." "What's that?" "A relationship." He looked away, jaw twitching. "You've taken almost half the portfolio." "I didn't take them. They followed." "That's a technicality." "No, that's everything." I leaned forward now, locking eyes with him. "You don't understand what you lost because you never understood what you had. Those contracts? They were ink. But the relationships? That was blood, Brandon. That was built one phone call, one late-night emergency, one genuine conversation at a time. You can't replace that with AI, automation, or ambition." His face had gone pale. "You think I'm proud of hurting Access Point?" I asked. "I gave them 15 years. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, pieces of my marriage. I didn't walk away with revenge in mind. I walked away with dignity." He swallowed hard. "The board thinks you're behind the collapse. I'm not behind anything. You are. You fired a legacy without understanding its weight." He rubbed his eyes. The silence stretched. "Tell me what happens next," he said quietly. I let the words settle between us. "The board already made their decision," I said. "They're finalizing the partnership. Your resignation was requested before you sat down at this table." He looked up sharply, but I wasn't finished. "But I didn't push for that. I didn't ask for your job. I asked for something better, for cooperation. A shared structure that preserves the people you are about to leave behind." His voice was barely audible now. "Why? Because destroying you wouldn't build anything, but building something stronger than before, that's what real leaders do." He stared at me for a long moment, and then whispered, "I underestimated you." "No," I said, "you never saw me to begin with." And with that, I stood. I didn't wait for him to follow. I didn't offer a handshake. I didn't look back. I walked out of Copper Blues, past the host stand, past the breakfast crowd, and stepped into the bright morning light with a stillness I hadn't felt in years. By the time I returned to the office, a new wave of emails had arrived. 3 more clients had initiated transfer protocols. I walked past Sterling and Rowe's legal wing, past the receptionist, and into my office, where now framed on the wall hung that photo of the original Access Point team. 4 faces in the sun, standing outside a rented shoebox of an office 15 years ago. One of them was Gerald Stone. One was me. 2 others had gone on to start their own firms. But all of us knew then what the new generation forgot. People sign contracts with people. Lisa called me later that day. "You ended it?" she asked, her voice cautious. "He ended himself," I said. "I just gave him a mirror." She let out a slow breath. "It's official now. Brandon's out, the board's voted. Gerald confirmed it himself." "And the partnership?" "Approved. The board issued a statement. They called it a strategic evolution born from market disruption." I laughed. "Nice way of saying, we underestimated the wrong person." Lisa chuckled. "They'll never admit it out loud, but they know." By Friday, the partnership between Sterling and Rowe and Access Point was the top story in every industry publication. Headlines praised the innovation, the structure, the client-centric design. But what they didn't write was the truth. This wasn't a corporate merger. It was a redemption. The story of a man fired not for failure, but for being too experienced, only to rise, not in revenge, but in resolve. And Brandon? He disappeared from the news cycles. Word around the grapevine said he'd taken a consulting role with a tech startup in Arizona. They were building predictive software for corporate hiring. The irony was almost poetic. The next Monday, I hosted our first joint client council, a roundtable with executives from both firms. They came not because they had to, but because they wanted to be part of something human again. After the meeting, James Redford approached me, shaking his head in wonder. "When they let you go, Marcus, I thought the industry had lost its mind," he said. I smiled. So did I. But now it feels like we've gained something. Not just gained, I said. Reclaimed. We made a mistake. Those words weren't spoken by Brandon. They came from Gerald Stone, former CEO and founder of Axis Point, now reluctantly reinstated as interim advisor to a board scrambling to reverse its nosedive. We sat in a quiet corner of the Sterling and Row Executive Lounge. The skyline of downtown Chicago stretched wide behind Gerald's slouched posture. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Lines etched deeper into his face, but his voice still carried the same gravity it had 15 years ago when he offered me a job and a handshake in a hallway with no air conditioning. "I told them not to bring in some kid who thinks you can automate empathy," he muttered, swirling the untouched whiskey in his glass. But they were dazzled by the numbers. Brandon promised them leaner teams, better margins, faster growth. "He gave them a spreadsheet," I said. "I gave them trust." Gerald looked up at me then. And in the end, that's what saved them. The board meeting had been called 2 days prior, an emergency session conducted in a private conference room at the Axis Point headquarters. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. Lisa was, and she had a front row seat to the fallout. Brandon arrived 15 minutes late, red-eyed, clearly sleep-deprived, armed with binders and half-baked excuses. They were supposed to be legacy clients, he argued. Risk-averse, traditional. I had projections. But the board didn't want projections. They wanted answers. How had nearly half the major accounts migrated in less than 3 weeks? Why were top clients, some of whom had renewed for decades without question, suddenly transferring without resistance? And most damning of all, why was Marcus Dorsey now the most trusted name in the portfolio? One director reportedly asked, "Did we fire our best player during playoffs?" When the CRM audit returned clean, no downloads, no logins, no evidence of client data theft, the board's tone shifted. This wasn't sabotage. This was self-destruction. By the end of the session, Brandon was asked to step outside, and an hour later, the decision was made. Effective immediately, he was to tender his resignation. The board had no desire to make a public mess of it. There were reputations, investors, and legal shields to preserve. But the damage was done, and the only viable path forward was the one they had once dismissed, me. That's when Gerald called. "I never should have left without a succession plan," he admitted, voice low. "You were the one who knew the clients better than anyone, knew the people." "It's not about what should have happened," I replied. "It's about what happens now." He raised an eyebrow. "So what do you want, Marcus?" I paused. The obvious answer would have been his job, the corner office. A clean reversal of the mistake they made. But I wasn't interested in re-entering a broken system just to wear a shinier suit. "I want a partnership," I said. "Not just a symbolic one. A real, operational alliance between Axis Point and Sterling and Row." Gerald narrowed his eyes. "You'd be sharing business with the company that fired you." "No," I corrected. "I'd be preserving business. You may not see it yet, but clients are exhausted. They don't want to choose between firms. They want continuity, trust, and efficiency. Let us give them both." "You want dual servicing?" he asked. "Shared onboarding? Revenue splitting?" "Yes," I said. "And I want complete control over the unified client relations division. No fluff, no middle layers. My team, my structure, my way." Gerald let out a long exhale, then leaned back. "You're not just rebuilding bridges," he said. "You're redrawing the map." The board took a day to deliberate. Patricia Rowe and I spent that time finalizing the joint proposal. Devin managed risk assessments. Our legal team ensured full compliance with trade law, IP boundaries, and fiduciary regulations. Every line was tailored to favor clients first. By Friday morning, I received the call. Gerald didn't waste time. They're in, all of them. Vote was unanimous. And the team? No layoffs, he confirmed. We're preserving every employee on both sides. No redundancies, no cuts. You'll lead the new division with full board oversight. I nodded. And Brandon? I asked. Gone, Gerald said. He left quietly, NDA signed, severance reduced. I said nothing, just sat with that for a moment. He never understood what he had. Gerald added after a beat. No, I replied. But I did. That afternoon we signed the official documents in a private boardroom. The tone was different this time. No tension, no gloating, just clarity. As I stood to speak after the ink dried, I looked around the room, faces I once feared now quietly respectful. I don't want this to be remembered as a rescue, I said, because it wasn't. Heads tilted. This was a reckoning, a realization that when you remove the soul from a business, you create a hollow machine. Clients don't leave because you stop sending gifts. They leave because you stop seeing them. I saw heads nod. Even Gerald looked proud. I didn't build something better because I was smarter, I added. I built something better because I remembered what we all used to know, that the people matter more than the numbers. And if we forget that again, we'll be right back here. A quiet stillness followed. Then, applause. Not thunderous, but earned. By the end of the week, client announcements were prepared. Joint branding materials approved. Legal teams synced. Emails sent. Access Point employees, those who had survived the chaos, breathed a collective sigh of relief. No one was being cut. No one was being replaced. Instead, they were being redeemed. James Redford called me that evening. You turned the whole thing around, he said. You didn't just walk away, you walked back in and rewired the system. I didn't want to burn it down, I replied. Just light it up enough for people to see what matters. He paused, then said something I'll never forget. Brandon saw clients as transactions. You saw them as legacy. That's why we followed you. Not because you're good at your job, but because you're good at being human. That night, I poured a glass of wine, stepped out onto my porch, and let the wind settle around me. The skyline glittered in the distance, Chicago alive with 1,000 possibilities. I thought about the irony of it all. Brandon tried to modernize trust, tried to quantify loyalty, tried to replace a human foundation with a digital facade. And in doing so, he reminded everyone why the old ways, the ones built on phone calls, eye contact, and promises kept, still matter most. I raised my glass to the quiet sky and whispered something I hadn't said in years. We're just getting started. This isn't a merger. I stood at the center of Sterling and Rowe's grand conference atrium, sunlight spilling through its glass ceiling, bouncing off polished wood and brushed steel. A crowd of nearly 100 filled the room. Clients, staff, board members, and longtime colleagues. They were all here for the formal unveiling of something more than a business deal. I continued, voice steady, clear. This is a restoration, a return to the values that made all of this possible in the first place. Behind me, a newly mounted plaque gleamed against the marble wall. It bore the names of both companies, Sterling and Rowe and Access Point Group, linked not by a slash or a hyphen, but by a single symbol. N. Not a wall, not a wedge, just a bridge, a partnership, not the kind brokered by desperation or convenience, but the kind built on shared scars, hard-won clarity, and a mutual promise not to repeat past mistakes. The weeks following Brandon Keene's quiet exit were some of the busiest and most fulfilling of my career. Our new joint client servicing model launched with precision. Each firm retained its own identity, but clients had unrestricted access to both sides' specialties. If Access Point's data systems could serve one need and Sterling's relational strength could serve another, clients didn't have to choose. They simply benefited. I worked with our teams personally, ensuring the culture was aligned. No bureaucratic haze, no diluted mission. Each member of the new division received a note from me, hand-signed. You're not part of a department. You're part of a promise. Let's build this the right way. Marcus Dorsey. One by one, they responded, not with speeches or applause, but with effort. Late nights, early calls. Clients began noticing instantly. I thought this would be complicated. Catherine Lee told me during a check-in. 2 firms, 1 service line, I expected delays. Any so far? I asked. She smiled. None. And I've never had faster email responses in 20 years. It wasn't just her. Word spread. Old clients who had stayed with Axis Point out of inertia now crossed over willingly. New prospects that once felt hesitant to deal with large firms were suddenly reaching out, curious about the partnership that actually worked. And behind it all, quietly, I kept steering the ship. A month after the rollout, I received a short call from Devin Blake. "You should see what the Ledger just published," he said, amused. I pulled it up on my laptop. "Quiet Genius Restructures Industry: How a Fired Executive Rewrote the Rules of Client Loyalty." They didn't use my name in the headline, but the article made it clear. They told the story of the exiled executive who lost his job to modernization, only to turn that dismissal into a multi-million-dollar shift in industry practice. They wrote about trust, about relational capital, about the importance of honoring legacy in an age of automation. They quoted James Redford, Catherine Lee, even Lisa. What struck me most, though, was the final line. In the end, he didn't beat his rivals. He simply became indispensable. That week, we held a private dinner at the Sterling & Row rooftop lounge. Clients, partners, and selected staff gathered under soft lights and warm spring air. The city shimmered around us. As I moved from table to table, shaking hands, listening to conversations that felt more like reunions than networking, I found myself standing beside Patricia Rowe. She had a flute of champagne in one hand, her expression thoughtful as she watched the room buzz with energy. "You know," she said quietly, "we could have waited another month and absorbed the rest of Axis Point's clients. Watched them implode." "I know," I said, "but instead, we saved them." "Not all of them," I corrected. "Just the ones who still mattered," she nodded. "You could have taken it all, Marcus, gone scorched earth." "I never wanted ashes," I replied. "I wanted something to stand on." She turned to look at me directly. "That's rare." "I'm not rare," I said. "I'm just someone who remembered why we started this in the first place." The next morning, I found a note on my desk, no signature, just a folded card and a photograph inside. The photograph was an old one. Me and Gerald Stone shaking hands in front of the first Axis Point office, back when the company name was still stenciled in fading blue paint on the glass. On the back of the photo, in Gerald's familiar scrawl, "You didn't just save the business, you reminded us all how to do business." We expanded the partnership's model slowly, deliberately. Other firms took notice. Calls started coming in from CEOs, venture groups, even international firms wanting to understand our formula. There was no formula, no app, no secret sauce, just something that can't be programmed. Listening, remembering, delivering, when it matters most. One afternoon, as I finished a call with a new client from Toronto, I spotted Jessica go walking into my office. She wore a bright smile, holding up 2 coffee cups. "Peace offering," she said, handing me one. "What am I being bribed into?" She shrugged. "Just wanted to sit. I've been reading everything. The articles, the announcements, even saw that LinkedIn post someone made calling you a client whisperer." I laughed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" she said. "Dad, you're literally running a dual company. You rebuilt an entire business sector because someone younger thought they could replace you with a graph and an intern." I smiled softly. "I'm just doing the job I was always meant to do. I just had to be fired first to remember that." She sat across from me, eyes softening. "I'm proud of you, you know." "I know," I said, "but I'm proud of you too, for always reminding me that I'm more than what I lost." She reached across the desk and touched my hand. "And now?" "Now," I said, "we build something that lasts." That evening I stayed late in the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to savor the quiet hum of something rebuilt, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with care. The lights of the city stretched across the windows, soft and unwavering. I pulled out that photo again, me and Gerald in front of a broken-down glass door, and next to it, I set a new photo, this time from the partnership dinner. 2 teams, 1 future. And at the center, not me in a spotlight, just me among them, where I belonged all along. He never understood what he was throwing away. Catherine Lee stood beside me at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The glow of Chicago bathed everything in soft amber, high rises shimmering like polished promises, the lake catching reflections like secrets held too long. Her tone wasn't bitter, just sad. Honest. We were nearing the end of the evening reception. The joint partnership was now fully operational, and tonight had been about more than celebration. It was acknowledgement. An admission by everyone in attendance, silent or spoken, that something had been lost, and that we had found a way to bring it back. Brandon thought trust could be downloaded, she added, that it could be rebuilt with an onboarding module and a CRM login. But you can't code what you lived. I nodded slowly. I never needed revenge, Catherine. I just needed them to remember. The final phase of our restructuring wasn't flashy. There were no IPOs or viral campaigns. No breathless analysts declaring us the next unicorn. Just a series of quiet wins. Client satisfaction metrics climbed 18% in the first month. Employee turnover dropped to near zero. Retired accounts came back, 1, then 2, then 10. And every time someone said, "We're ready to return," it wasn't a business transaction. It was a homecoming. One afternoon, as I walked past the now combined client services floor, I noticed a young associate named Ty, barely 25, sharp, curious, on the phone with a client. "No, Mr. Ackerman, I remember," Ty was saying. "Your grandson's wedding is next month, right?" "Absolutely. I'll make sure everything is ready before you leave." I stopped for a moment, just listened. Ty wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't following protocol. He was connecting. That was the future. Not automation, continuation. 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, a real letter. The envelope was thick, expensive, like something used for weddings or condolences. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned. Inside was a note. "Marcus," I watched it happen, slowly. When I came in, I didn't think I was replacing anyone. I thought I was improving something broken. I realize now I was the break. You didn't just keep your integrity, you kept your humanity. I hope one day I can learn to lead like that. Brandon, I sat with that letter for a long time. No smugness, no triumph, just understanding. He hadn't written for my forgiveness. He hadn't asked for a second chance. He just wanted to admit the truth. And that, ironically, was the first real act of leadership I'd seen from him. That weekend, I had dinner with Jessica. She chose a quiet bistro in Lincoln Park, one of those places where time seemed to slow down, where candles flickered instead of ceiling fluorescence, and laughter felt like a language of its own. She'd brought a gift, a framed quote. "The best revenge is not destruction, it's proving you were never the problem." Unknown. I chuckled as I read it. "Fitting, isn't it?" she said, sipping her wine. I set it on the table. "I'm not sure I believe in revenge at all." "Oh, come on," she teased. "You burned him beautifully." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't light the fire, I just walked away with the matchbox before he realized he was standing in gasoline." She laughed until she cried. So did I. On Monday morning, I came in early. The building was quiet, no footsteps, no ringing phones, just that sacred stillness before the world wakes up. I unlocked my office, sat down, and opened the top drawer. Inside were 2 photographs. The first, me and Gerald Stone, 15 years ago, in front of our first office with our sleeves rolled and dreams heavier than our pockets. The second, the night of the partnership celebration. Teams from both firms. Former rivals now laughing like cousins at a family reunion. I was there, not in front, not on stage, just in the crowd, my smile wide, my arms crossed in quiet peace. I pulled out a brass frame from the side cabinet and placed both photos side by side on my desk. One for where we began. One for what we reclaimed. As the office filled in that morning, voices rising, coffee brewing, keyboards clicking, I looked out at a team that had once been divided. Now, it moved as one. Not because of my name, not because of a memo, but because they all saw what I saw from the start, that doing business the right way still matters. That trust, once earned, can weather any storm, even one brought on by arrogance in a designer suit. Before my first meeting, I picked up the phone and made one final call. To Gerald Stone. "I just wanted to thank you," I said. "I should be thanking you," he replied. "You built something I couldn't, and you healed a company I thought was past saving." "I didn't save it," I said. "I reminded it." He laughed softly. "You always were better at chess than I gave you credit for." "I wasn't playing chess, Gerald." No, I was just being honest. That was the move they didn't see coming." 6 months later, we were featured on the cover of American Business Monthly. Headline, "The Man Who Made Loyalty Scale." I never framed it. I didn't need to, because I already had the only thing that mattered, the trust of those who mattered most. And that right there was the quiet triumph. Not a press release, not a promotion, but a legacy carved in choices, measured not in dollars or charts, but in people who stayed, because I never walked away from them, even when others walked away from me. And in the end, when the final tally was made, not in revenue, but in reverence, I stood not as a man who returned to prove himself, but as a man who never needed to. Sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one holding the entire foundation together. Marcus Dorsey didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate with fury. He walked out with grace, then returned with legacy, loyalty, and a silent army of trust at his back. In a world obsessed with disruption, he proved that dignity, consistency, and care still outlast trends. He didn't just survive being discarded, he reshaped the entire industry from the ashes of that mistake. And in the end, while others scrambled to rebuild what they had broken, Marcus reminded everyone of one timeless truth. People don't follow companies. People follow people who never forget them. The room buzzed with anticipation, not from nerves, but purpose. The conference suite at Midtown National Bank had been transformed, not with expensive art or velvet chairs, but with long tables, whiteboards, and a quiet dignity that came from inclusion, not opulence. At the head of the room, Evan Price stood in silence for a moment, gazing out at the 20 young entrepreneurs seated before him. Their eyes held different shapes, shades, and histories, but every one of them shared the same expression. They were ready. Ready to prove wrong every counselor who'd said they should start small, every investor who'd said the market isn't ready for this, every bank officer who'd glanced at their face, their skin, their last name, and silently decided, not you. Not today. Today they were at the table. And Evan? He wasn't just the host, he was the bridge. Evan's voice was soft, but it filled the room like a hymn. 1 year ago, I walked into this building with $50 million in my briefcase. He didn't need to raise it. The weight of the number settled naturally. I had an appointment, a name on the calendar, smiles in the email thread, promises in bold print. He looked around the room, not to impress but to connect. But I wasn't seen. Not really. I was evaluated, sized up, and quietly dismissed. You ever had someone smile while denying your worth? Nearly every head in the room nodded slowly. I didn't fight back with a lawsuit or a speech. I fought back with silence. He paused, then smiled faintly, and then I spoke with my actions, and the world listened. Layla stepped forward, handing each entrepreneur a folder. Inside, a multi-page onboarding guide, access credentials to NovaPoint's mentorship portal, a pre-approved startup banking account with a 6-figure cap, and a personal contact at the Financial Equity Initiative for audit protection. Evan watched their expressions shift, not with glee, but with something deeper. Recognition. Someone had seen them, and more than that, believed in them. This isn't charity, Evan said, his tone firmer now. This is strategy. Because the next wave of innovation, of culture, of wealth, it's going to come from people who've been overlooked too long. He looked toward a quiet man in the corner. And not just the ones who look like me. Across the room stood Ava Tran, 24, Vietnamese American, and co-founder of a microloan startup aimed at refugee families. Her company had just received its first equity boost through Evan's fund. She stood when Evan mentioned her name. When I was an intern at Titan Investments, she said quietly, my supervisor said I was too soft-spoken for client meetings. He told me to shadow the receptionist until I learned how to carry myself like a professional. A few soft gasps moved through the room. Ava's hands didn't tremble. Today, that same firm asked for a seat in our funding round. I told them we were looking for partners who didn't need subtitles to hear us. The room erupted. Not in applause, but in a wave of emotion that couldn't be clapped away. Ava sat back down, but the air had shifted again. Something bigger was rising in that room. Back on the executive floor, Midtown's President Howard Ellison was fielding a different kind of call. They want him? He asked, stunned. But he turned us down. The voice on the other end belonged to the Federal Reserve's Community Reinvestment Committee. That's exactly why we want him, Howard. He didn't just walk away. He built something stronger. The president's task force on equitable lending is forming, and they want Evan Price leading it. Howard sat back. The irony was poetic. Midtown had once denied this man a conference room. Now the country wanted to give him the floor. Send him our congratulations, Howard finally said. But he already knew. Evan wouldn't need a title to shape the future. He already was. At a cozy second-floor cafe in Brooklyn, James Morales sat with a group of interns from NovaPoint's financial division. He was no longer the young guy at the desk. He was now vice president of strategic partnerships, with a portfolio larger than the one Jonathan Pierce once claimed only real investors could handle. James poured tea carefully, gesturing to the stack of printed bank audit reports on the table. "This is how we protect people," he said. "Not by yelling, by documenting, by making it impossible for institutions to pretend they didn't know." One of the interns, a sharp-eyed woman with deep coils in her hair, raised her hand. "Do you think they're really changing? The banks?" James didn't hesitate. "Some of them, not all. But here's the difference. Now they're being watched, and that changes everything." In a sterile office park 2 counties away, Jonathan Pierce stood under fluorescent lights, adjusting his tie for the 5th time that morning. He was interviewing for a mid-level compliance officer role at a regional firm no one had heard of. The HR manager shook his hand with practiced politeness. "We'll be in touch," she said, smiling tightly. But Jonathan knew. She'd already recognized him. The videos still haunted his digital footprint, the hashtags, the screenshots, his face frozen mid-sneer, his hand caught in the act of tearing the application in half. No amount of charm could erase what had been recorded in history's high definition. And in that moment, as he walked back to his car alone, Jonathan finally felt what Evan had felt a year earlier. Not exclusion, but erasure. That evening, back at Evan's home, the sunset spilled gold across the windows of his study. The fireplace was low, soft. The city below shimmered like a jewel held gently in his palm. Layla stepped in with 2 glasses of champagne. "To 1 year," she said. "To many more," Evan replied, raising his glass. He pulled out the letter from the 13-year-old boy in Baltimore, now laminated and framed near the shelf that held no awards, only books. "He wrote again," Evan said. Leela smiled. "Same boy?" Evan nodded. "He wants to intern at NovaPoint next summer, says he's already drafting business plans for a solar-powered delivery bike." They laughed, but it wasn't casual laughter. It was the sound of hope echoing. Leela said, "You never got revenge." "No," Evan replied, looking at the framed letter, "but I got something better." "What's that?" Evan turned, eyes calm. "I made them remember me by making sure they'd never forget us." They had called it a financial anomaly, a momentary PR disaster, a one-off mistake. But they were wrong. What happened at Midtown National Bank when a black tech CEO stood in silence and tore a $50 million check in half wasn't a blip. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution. And like all revolutions that matter, it didn't start with a riot. It started with a chair left empty for far too long. The first ripple landed at Haverly Trust, one of the oldest private banks on the East Coast. Their board met in a mahogany-paneled room overlooking the river. Every portrait on the wall featured a white man with silver hair and a stern gaze. That week, a junior associate submitted an anonymous memo to the boardroom table. The subject line? "What would we have done if Evan Price walked through our doors?" There was silence, until the youngest board member, a black woman named Danielle Vaughn, cleared her throat. "The real question isn't what we would have done, it's what we're doing now." The room fell into thoughtful quiet. By the end of the quarter, Haverly Trust had rewritten its client intake procedures. Every associate was retrained under a new framework, developed in partnership with the Financial Equity Initiative. Not because they were afraid of a scandal, but because they were afraid of being left behind. 3 months later, in a downtown DC auditorium filled with civic leaders, small business owners, journalists, and bank presidents, Evan Price stepped onto the stage for the inaugural summit of the Financial Equity Initiative. The crowd stood before he spoke, not out of celebrity, but out of gratitude. Layla introduced him simply, the man who made silence echo across an industry. Evan approached the lectern, the backdrop behind him a soft navy blue etched with the words fairness, transparency, future. He didn't speak of discrimination that day. He spoke of design. "We can't solve bias with slogans," he began. "We solve it by designing systems where dignity is built into every step, where assumptions don't hold the pen, and every client, every entrepreneur walks into a room already seen." He raised a thick white binder in his hand. Inside this is the first ever National Lending Fairness Score, based on real data from audits across 500 institutions. Gasps rippled across the room. It's not about shame, Evan said. It's about accountability. You can't fix what you don't measure. Then he smiled. But we will measure, and we will fix it. Meanwhile, Midtown National Bank had changed more than its staff. They had changed who they were. In the 12 months following the check tearing, the bank had increased minority business lending by 320%, established a client equity board composed of real community members, partnered with NovaPoint to fund an entrepreneurship fellowship for underserved youth, and most shockingly to the old guard, their stock had recovered faster than expected, bolstered by new partnerships, younger clients, and reputational repair. But the most symbolic change came in a simple, quiet ceremony in their newly built community room. A bronze plaque was unveiled. At the top, engraved in elegant serif, "This room exists because one man refused to leave." Beneath it, Evan Price Business Resource Center. Dedicated to every person ever told they didn't belong. The first person to cut the ribbon wasn't Evan, it was Ava Tran, the once dismissed intern who now ran a 7-figure business funding immigrant women founders. She spoke through tears. He didn't just hold the door open, he built the building. In a modest brick apartment above a quiet bakery, James Morales still lived simply. Despite his new salary, office, and press appearances, he had kept his old routine. Public transit, coffee from the same corner shop, his tattered college backpack. But everything else had changed. He was now considered one of the most influential young executives in ethical finance. When asked by a journalist how he stayed grounded, he answered without hesitation, "Because I remember watching a man get humiliated in front of me, and saying nothing. I've been making up for it ever since." James now taught a remote course at 3 HBCUs titled Finance with a Backbone. His students didn't just learn about assets and equity. They learned how to read a room, how to challenge systems, and most importantly, how to stand up when others look away. One morning, Evan received a call marked unknown. He answered out of curiosity. "Mr. Price," said the familiar voice on the other end, "I've read your reports, watched your summit. Your initiative is exactly the kind of progress we want to support at a national level." It was the President of the United States. "How can we help you do more of what you're doing?" Evan, quiet as always, didn't gloat. He simply responded, "Tell the country that dignity isn't a transaction, it's a guarantee." A week later, the White House announced a partnership with the Financial Equity Initiative to expand banking fairness across all 50 states. And on a cold autumn morning, Evan stood under the Capitol dome, not seeking validation, but offering vision. On the anniversary of the day he had been removed from Midtown's lobby, Evan returned, unannounced. No entourage, no media, just him. The new receptionist didn't recognize him immediately. "Good morning, sir. Do you have an appointment?" He smiled. "No, I just wanted to see if the place had changed." She returned the smile, eyes scanning the check-in system. "Actually, I think I know who you are." She paused. "Thank you for what you did." He nodded. Then he turned and walked into the community room, where 24 young entrepreneurs were now gathered around loan officers, business mentors, and bankers with open portfolios and open minds. A Latina teen was pitching her idea for a tech-driven farmers market app. A boy with hearing aids was describing his custom shoe business for children with disabilities. None of them knew who Evan was. And that was the point. "The revolution is working," he whispered to himself, "because I'm no longer the only one tearing checks." A quiet afternoon settled over Eastbridge Community College, a modest brick campus nestled between 2 abandoned factories and a freeway overpass. It wasn't the kind of place where billion-dollar conversations happened. But that day, a voice from the back of the lecture hall cut through the hum of fluorescent lights. "Professor Morales, did Evan Price ever think he'd change this much?" The question came from Malik Johnson, a 19-year-old business student with fraying sneakers and brilliance tucked behind guarded eyes. James Morales leaned on the edge of the podium, the weight of the question sinking in. "He didn't think it," James said. "He planned it." The students looked at him, wide-eyed. He didn't just want justice for himself. He wanted to make sure no one else had to walk into a lobby and prove their worth before being heard. James looked down at his syllabus, then closed it. You know what? Forget today's lecture. Let me tell you about the day the doors stayed open. It began with a chance meeting. A junior banking associate, nervous, fresh out of undergrad, had stepped into an elevator at a Midtown satellite branch, holding an armful of files, 3 Starbucks cups, and a folder titled Underserved Market Segments. She was on her way to a senior meeting where she was not invited to speak. Evan Price was already in the elevator. She didn't recognize him at first, not until she dropped one of her cups and he bent down to pick it up for her. Thank you, sir. Sorry, I didn't mean to. You doing all right? Evan asked kindly. Just trying to keep my mouth shut and my hands full. He smiled. Wrong way around. Speak up, the world's already full of quiet people with full hands. She blinked, and then she blurted, I built a pitch. It's not official, but it's a program to bring microloans into high school financial ed programs, teach them how to apply for real accounts before they ever touch debt. Evan didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss. He asked for her name. Sierra, she said, blinking rapidly. Sierra Lane. Send it to me, Sierra. But you're not. Doesn't matter who I am. You have an idea, that's enough. She sent the pitch that night. 1 month later, it was greenlit by NovaPoint's Youth Capital Access Accelerator. And within 6 months, Sierra Lane had gone from junior banking assistant to director of youth inclusion policy, designing the very programs she once thought no one would ever read. On the edge of Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where banks had long since pulled out and payday lenders lined the corners, a new sign was installed above an old storefront. The Price Center for Financial Dignity. Inside, there were no velvet ropes, no marble columns, just folding tables, laptops, and 5 staffers trained to offer zero-interest startup capital to residents with ideas and determination, but no formal financial history. The first recipient? Mrs. Eloise Harding, age 62. She'd spent 40 years as a school custodian and had a secret recipe for hot pepper jelly that had been passed down through 4 generations. She'd never had a credit card, never taken a loan. She only trusted cash. But this time, a banker sat across from her and asked not what she had, but what she dreamed of. I just want a booth at the farmer's market, she whispered. And maybe my own label. 2 weeks later, her jars were sold in 5 local stores. The name, E.P. Heat, in honor of the man who opened the door. In a medium security facility in Ohio, something strange had happened. A group of incarcerated men, many of them there for nonviolent financial crimes tied to survival, were enrolled in a pilot program funded by the Equity Initiative. The program taught financial literacy, entrepreneurship, and post-release credit reconstruction. On the wall of the classroom hung a quote, "They may lock your body, but don't ever let them bankrupt your future." EP. One of the men, a former barber named Tyrese, created a post-release mobile grooming service targeting rural areas where Black residents had no access to barbershops. By the time of his parole hearing, he had pre-booked 82 appointments. The parole board cited his business plan and the credibility of the initiative as part of their decision. Tyrese walked out a free man, into a world that, for the first time, seemed willing to finance his freedom. Layla sat in her office, flipping through a thick packet of grant requests. The Financial Equity Initiative had just been named a finalist for a Global Impact Award, and the donations were pouring in. But Layla was focused on one particular envelope. It was handwritten, with no return address. Inside was a single page, a note from an anonymous Midtown employee who had worked the day Evan was removed. I didn't speak up, I didn't even look at you, but I watched everything, and I promised myself, never again. I now work at a nonprofit credit union. We use your playbook. We teach our tellers that character doesn't wear a suit. It walks with calm eyes, like yours did that day. Layla folded the note with care and placed it in a drawer. Next to it were dozens of others, the unseen ripples of one man's silence. Evan rarely spoke about his childhood, but those who knew him best knew where the fire came from. It came from his mother's kitchen, where bills were paid in cash, in whispers with hands that shook and hopes that bent but didn't break. Where his mother once told him, "Don't let them tell you that wealth is a language you have to learn. You already speak it. With your kindness, your presence, your eyes." So when he received a letter from his old elementary school principal asking if he'd visit for career day, Evan didn't hesitate. He returned to the cracked sidewalks, the faded murals, the auditorium with folding chairs and the lingering smell of cafeteria trays. He walked in, not with a keynote, but with a smile. The children stared at him, tall, quiet, composed. One girl raised her hand. "Are you famous?" Evan chuckled. "No, but I am free." "What do you do?" He thought for a long moment, then said, "I help people who were once told no find their yes." The teachers wept, the children clapped, and on the front lawn of the school, beneath an old oak tree, a stone was placed weeks later. "This school teaches finance, fairness, and the price of dignity." On a rooftop in Brooklyn, during a networking dinner for Nova Point Fellows, Layla stood beside Evan as the city glittered beneath them. "Do you realize," she whispered, "what you've done?" "Not yet," Evan said. "It's not finished." She laughed softly. "The banks are changing, the government's listening, you're getting statues, plaques, quotes in business books." "All good," Evan nodded. "But I'll rest when the first kid who walks into a bank in dirty sneakers and a dream gets offered coffee instead of a cold shoulder." He looked at the sky, streaked with the last light of dusk. "That's when I'll know we've really won." It was early. The city had not yet stirred to life. Streetlights still blinked on corners, and the wind carried the scent of new rain across the marble steps of the National Museum of American Legacy in Washington, D.C. Inside, a small group of curators worked in reverent silence. They were assembling something different today. Not a relic of war, not an artifact of conquest, but a moment that changed how America banks, builds, and believes. At the center of the new exhibit, a pane of crystal-clear glass holding a torn piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, half of a $50 million cashier's check. Below it, engraved in bronze, "This is what dignity looks like when it refuses to be sold." Evan Price, April 17th, 20XX. Evan hadn't planned to attend. He'd been invited, of course, personally, by the Secretary of Commerce and the director of the Smithsonian Foundation. The letter had been eloquent, formal. "Your moment has become more than a memory. It's become a blueprint for resistance, for reform, for rising." But Evan had always resisted the spotlight. So when the day came, reporters waited in vain. Photographers kept their cameras lifted, scanning every suit and limousine. He didn't walk the red carpet. He entered through the side. No fanfare, just purpose. And when the curtain dropped to reveal the new Voices of Integrity exhibit, the crowd gasped. Not at the artifact, but at the presence of the man who once stood in silence as the world watched him be dismissed. Now he stood tall, beside the very symbol of that dismissal. Only now reframed as a symbol of resistance, resolve, and rebirth. After the ceremony, Evan stood near the back of the exhibit, hands folded behind him. He stared not at the torn check, but at the digital display next to it. It showed a map, dozens of red dots across the country. Each dot represented a branch, a credit union, a program, a classroom, or a boardroom where the Financial Equity Initiative had reformed policy. One of the museum's archivists approached him quietly. "You may never know how many lives you've touched," she said softly. "I don't need to," Evan replied. "That was never the point." "Then what was the point?" she asked. He looked back at the check, his voice barely above a whisper. "To make sure no one else had to prove they mattered before they were believed." 1 week later, Evan returned to Midtown National Bank for the final time. This visit was different. He wasn't there to give a speech, or fund a program, or attend a ribbon cutting. He walked in alone. The staff knew him instantly, of course. Whispers spread like wildfire through the marble lobby, but Evan walked past the reception desk, the teller lines, and the elevators. He walked to the bench in the waiting area. And he sat. The same place he had sat 1 year and 7 months earlier, holding a check the world believed he was too black, too casual, too different to carry. Now, he carried nothing but stillness. A small boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve nearby. "Mom, that's him. That's the man from the video." Evan turned and smiled gently. The mother flushed with surprise. "I'm sorry, he watches that clip all the time." "No need to apologize," Evan said kindly. "What's his name?" "Micah." Evan extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Micah." The boy grinned. "I want to be a bank boss one day, like you." Evan chuckled, warm and deep. "Then promise me one thing," he said. "When someone walks in dressed different or speaking softly, don't see a stranger. See a story you haven't heard yet." Micah nodded solemnly. "I promise." Back in his office at Nova Point headquarters, a glass tower overlooking the harbor, Evan received a short call from the governor of New York. "Evan," the governor said, "we've passed the Fair Access Finance Act. Inspired by your initiative, it's law now. Lending transparency, client verification equity, hiring accountability. You just made it illegal to treat people like I was treated." Evan didn't reply immediately, but the corners of his mouth curved just slightly. "Then we're getting somewhere." "One more thing," the governor added. "We're renaming the financial equity clause. It'll be called the price provision." For a long moment, Evan said nothing. Then, "I'm honored. But just make sure it works. I don't need a name in ink. I need results in flesh." That spring, Layla was married in the garden at her family's estate. Evan stood at her side, not as a boss, but as the man she often described as her compass in chaos. During the reception, she pulled him aside beneath the wisteria canopy. "You never stop moving," she said, "even when the world told you to sit down." "That's the secret," he replied. "If they make you wait, build your own clock." She smiled. "How long will you keep building?" Evan glanced at the children playing on the lawn. At Micah, now wearing a tiny blazer, pretending to hold business meetings with the cake vendors, until the day kids like him walk into any room and feel like they've always belonged. A decade passed. And still the story of Evan Price echoed. There were books, case studies, documentaries, a feature film even. But Evan remained elusive. He didn't attend premieres, didn't accept awards. He spent most of his time mentoring, funding, walking into rooms that had forgotten whole communities existed, and reminding them. And in every city, every neighborhood, you could find them. The people who carried his flame. Bankers who trained their staff in equity. Teachers who taught his story. Founders who credited their first yes to his blueprint. One of those founders was Micah Price Johnson, now 20. The boy from the waiting room, the kid with the promise in his eyes. He stood on the same summit stage his hero once stood on. And when asked what legacy meant to him, he smiled, pointed to a worn image of a torn check and said, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you leave burning in others." Evan Price didn't just teach us how to walk into rooms that said no, he taught us how to build better ones. The crowd rose in thunderous applause, and somewhere in the audience, unseen by most, Evan Price sat in the back row. No spotlight, no plaque, just presence, watching the flame catch fire in the next generation. Back in the museum, as new school groups filed past the exhibit case holding the torn check, one little girl tugged at her teacher's hand. "What's that?" The teacher smiled. "That's a piece of paper." "Why is it so special?" The teacher knelt, pointing to the quote etched in the glass, "Because sometimes one piece of paper can be more powerful than 1,000 speeches." The girl blinked. "Because it had money on it?" "No," the teacher whispered, "because someone tore it, and the world had to listen." Dignity doesn't come from what you hold in your hands, but from what you refuse to drop when the world pushes you to your knees. Evan Price. In a world where wealth speaks loudly but prejudice whispers cruelly, Evan Price didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. They humiliated him, tore up his application, and tried to erase his presence. But he didn't argue, he didn't beg. He simply tore up a $50 million check, walked out, and watched their empire collapse behind him. And from that single act of quiet defiance, he didn't just spark a conversation, he ignited a nationwide transformation. Because dignity isn't a luxury, it's non-negotiable.